to an unlisted? Because in fact, that's what somebody proposed.
Yeah,
That's
that's not the way the law works.
But then again, if there's no Seqr police,
So, well, no, in fact, whether they're Seqr police or not, if an action is on the type 1 list, it's a type 1, it cannot become unlisted. The law doesn't work like that. So if it's one of the 54 categories of projects that are in the law, then it's type 1. That's all. And the agency, the lead agency, generally knows that. So I heard about that proposal, and I'd have to hear his arguments, but, and there's a big but, if it's on the type 1 list, it's a type 1 action.
But you know, and just this, not to get it off topic again, but I did actually check into that today. I was curious, and the question didn't come from the action. It came from just looking at the Seqr regs without seeing first what the action actually said. So it's not qualified as an unlisted in that case.
especially since the EAF is already a type 1, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the involved agency is the one that has the most direct jurisdiction, and that's usually at the most local level, because who reviews site plans? It's usually the planning board, so they're usually the lead agency. They wouldn't be the lead agency when it's a comp plan, for example, and I think I showed you an example of that in here, a Schoharie County plan, right? That, that has the potential to impact a whole community. So it's considered a type 1 because it's over 25 acres, unless that community is under 25 acres, that would be a mighty small community. But it may be a type 1, and it may not have to go to the full environmental impact statement, because it will maybe not have any potential negative impact. We'll come back to that in a minute. Another example of a type 1 I wanted to mention, and I'm sorry I didn't give you an example of this. If a highway repaves and does not change any, doesn't broaden or add a lane, it's probably not a type 1. But if it does add a lane, it may be a type 1 because it might have to cut down more trees or cause more runoff or cut into some environmental resource, or even affect the neighborhood near it. So, okay, so the lead agency is that body that's is responsible for determining whether there's an EIS, and they're generally the one that is going to go on and give the underlying approval, the site plan approval, the special use permit. An involved agency is any other agency that has a discretionary decision to make, let's say the Landmarks Commission, or the Zoning Board of Appeals, or even, let's say, well, the county is not one. The county is not an involved agency because their approvals are generally considered to be recommendations and not requirements. So they would be an interested agency. So what happens next is, after you've established who the lead agency is, like I said, generally it's the planning board, and in the case of a comp plan or a law, it might be the common council or the town board. This is really redundant, but let's talk a little bit about coordinated and uncoordinated review. So there's no review for type 2 actions. And the uncoordinated review is not necessary if there's only one agency involved in that decision. But if there are several agencies involved in a decision, and this goes back to your question, Alona, then the review should be coordinated. The exception to the coordinated review is if one agency says, I don't agree with you, I don't think that you are making the right decision, then they actually have the prerogative to run this. Let's say the other one says, no Seqr process, no pos dec. We'll get to what positive dec means in a minute. No full environmental impact statement. The other agency could say, you know what, I think it is a pos dec. And they can actually run an uncoordinated review. It happens very rarely. So, but they have that right. So establishing the lead agency, it's generally the agency that first receives the application, and they have to identify all the involved agencies. They have to send them the packet that they received. They advise them that a lead agency, I don't know if you guys got that at the Landmarks Commission, they advise them that the lead agency has to be established. They say that they intend to be the lead agency, and they include the first part of the environmental assessment form so everybody can review it. And that's supposed to happen within 30 days. Everyone's supposed to agree on who becomes the lead agency, and then that's established by consensus, and we move on, except in that situation where they disagree. So, coordinated review. Let me see what I want you to take away from this slide, because there's a lot on it.
Hey Jenny,
Yeah.
so a developer or applicant could, for Kingston, send the packet to the planning board.
Mm-hmm.
The planning board is an involved agency. The planning board would then identify the other involved agencies and then send that packet out.
That's right.
As well as an involved agency wanting to lead the environmental review
That's right.
process.
Right.
Would ask permission
That's right.
from the other involved agencies who have 30 days to say yes or no.
Yes.
And they don't necessarily have to respond for it to be a yes.
If they don't respond, it's
a yes.
it's a default
Okay, good.
answer. So Rebecca was recapping that the agency that receives the application is generally the lead agency because they're the ones who you're seeking approval from, let's say for your site plan, right? They're the ones who have to inform all the other agencies that have decisions to make, i.e. involved agencies, and those agencies have 30 days to review and say we don't want to be lead agency and agree on the coordinated review.
And so they have to approve the lead agency. Do they also comment on it?
They can comment on it, but it's not yet time for them to say whether they think it's a pos or neg deck.
But they can make comments.
They can make comments. Mm-hmm. They can say whatever they want, but generally it's not the time for them to do that, but they can review the environmental assessment form and they could say, oh, you left out the plume, from the smokestack, or you forgot to mention that it's an impaired waterway. Remember that?
Yep.
So they can do that. So that's their time to basically say, hey, lead agency, this environmental assessment form looks good to me. Because they're basically providing good advice. That's their responsibility as a member of that municipality or agency to say, this can't be approved because, or this looks good because when it comes time for us to make our decision, this looks fine, or this doesn't look fine. So that's their duty as an involved agency. So then the lead agency takes on the responsibility of the rest of the process, and I think we might need a little stretch break, but do you want to just do a stand-up stretch, or you want to just keep plowing through? Yeah, let's keep going. So this is where they're responsible for making that determination of significance. We're going to find out what that all-important thing is, and that's where the rubber meets the road in Seqr. Determination of significance is the most important step in Seqr because this is where the lead agency decides whether or not they think, based on the environmental assessment form, the project has even one potential adverse environmental impact. And at that point, if it does, they are technically supposed to determine that it is a positive declaration, meaning that it should go through the full Seqr process. We'll come back to that during discussion. In that case, if it is, there's an environmental impact assessment statement is needed, and the environmental assessment form is the main tool that they use to make that determination. We'll come back to looking at it at the specific criteria, but there are three basic criteria. The indicators of significant adverse environmental impacts, the potential short-term, long-term, direct, indirect, cumulative, and the magnitude and likelihood, which I left off there, of consequence. So the environmental assessment form, I don't want to go through every detail. There are short ones, there are long ones. That's Seqr 201. But suffice it to say that it works this way. There are 3 parts. The project information, which the person who's applying for the project puts down. The part 2, which the lead agency looks at, and that's their evaluation of the part 1, making sure that they're verifying the adequacy of all the pieces that were included. And then finally their evaluation, that's part 3, and that's the lead agency again. I think I'm gonna skip that because I already said that. The completion of the first form is the applicant, and the evaluation of it is the responsibility of the lead agency. Wow, that's a lot of stuff. So these are all the features that are included in the environmental assessment form, and if you went on into an environmental impact statement, those would be all the potential categories that you should explore in an environmental impact statement, but not necessarily. It's not required. It depends on whether it needs to be in the scope. But here's what the form looks like, and it's actually, actually not as hard as it looks. I've done it before. I've done it when I worked for developers, and I've helped them get through it and look at all the different factors on the site. It's actually quite helpful to everyone because it creates this kind of uniform process by which you can understand what's going on the property, on the site, and for the action. So in part 3, so I think I skipped over part 2, and I think it's just too detailed for this presentation, but the lead agency evaluates the potential impacts, the likely impacts, the duration, the magnitude, and then it provides an evaluation. And again, this will be up on kingstoncitizens.org, so you could read it before bedtime.
I have a question. Is that deliberation process public?
Sorry?
Is the deliberation process public?
All public. All
so
public.
that would take place at a planning board meeting?
It takes place in different steps. There's public comment period, there's scoping, and we'll get to that. And then there's afterwards a public hearing, which would generally be held because of the other review, what I'm referring to as the underlying review. Public hearing is not required during Seqr, but it is required for many processes after Seqr. Yeah.
So for part 2, the lead agency is reviewing basically what's been self-reported by
Right.
the applicant.
Right.
And at that point, wouldn't it make sense for the involved agencies to have already given some sort of feedback for them to also start to evaluate?
The involved agencies at any given time can provide feedback, and they often do so in the public comment period, but they can do so at any time. They definitely do so in scoping, which is part of the environmental impact statement. But yes, when they receive the environmental assessment form, they, at that time, as I mentioned, they can say whether or not they consider it to be adequate, especially from the point of view of the things they have to approve.
Now, are the studies that various developers may commission themselves, those should be part of public record as well, correct?
Once the application is considered a complete application, everything is subject to FOIL.
However, I mean, during the review
Freedom of
process,
information law.
But during the review process, could the public have
Yes.
access
Yes.
to these?
All of it is, yes. All of it. So before you get to determination of significance, they're just gathering information. And at that point, if you wanted to FOIL it, anything that the government receives is subject to FOIL. Freedom of information law. Yes?
So one of the things that we come up against a lot is that when the Seqr process begins and there's a 30-day window to determine a lead agency,
Yeah.
a lot of the agencies that are involved meet only once a month.
Right.
So it ends
They
up.
have to call a special meeting in order to do that.
They would have to do
Yeah.
that, and the timing of Seqr, if you're not certain how the process is, every project seems to have a little slightly different time frame. But
Right.
the Seqr regulations lays out
Yes, it
times
does.
probably to keep people or keep the project moving.
Well, there are very particular reasons for certain parts.
But my question is,
Mhm.
when an agency meets once a month to make a decision about any of it? a
So
lead
they have to,
agency
if they receive an application and it's 2 weeks before their meeting, that's still not 30 days when they meet. They do have to they have to be on top of it. They do have to, generally what happens is with the help of staff, these things, they call a special meeting, they convene and they start canvassing all the involved agencies, but they're supposed to do it within 30 days.
Do you see that often in municipalities that are thinking about, I mean, seekers?
Yeah, those timeframes are hard for them.
Somewhat mysterious, like I notice.
It's very mysterious. I go all over the state and teach communities about it, and
Right.
the time, but I will get to the point where we talk about literal and substantive compliance. If you do not do the proper procedural steps in every step along the way, you're more likely to fail a legal challenge than even the substantive compliance. Why? Because judges can look at procedure very easily and say, oops, you did that one wrong. You failed to do the procedure correctly. It's a very easy way to throw out a case.
Saying
Or-
that to the
or
lead
rule
agency,
against a case.
not to the involved agencies. Saying that to the lead agency in terms of steps to take.
What I'm saying is if the lead agency does not do its process correctly,
Right.
it may be difficult for it to withstand a legal
Right.
challenge.
I was talking about the involved agencies, but
The involved
that's-
agencies, if they do not, for example, let's say the Landmarks Commission only meets every 2 months, and they receive this and nobody's, no one's telling them, they didn't receive a notice from the clerk, whatever, or they received a notice from the clerk, but they didn't respond to a notice from the clerk, then at that point, they essentially by default, sort of give up their, not give up their involvement, but they remain involved, but unfortunately, the way it works, because it's self-enforcing, is that the municipality has every incentive to make sure that they do it, right? So that there isn't a hole in the process.
right, good, thanks.
It's very hard to, explain all of this, and so I hope I'm not losing you. But, okay, so the determination of significance. So case law establishes a lot of this, and that's why we have these lists of whether or not something is potentially considered to have a potential impact. And so case law looks at all the relevant impacts and thinks about whether there's a basis in law for saying that could be an environmental impact. So, for example, a project that has PFOA and is over an aquifer. Well, there's already a lot of case law that says you don't want to see that happen, right? We're talking about examples like what's happening in Newburgh or what happened in Hoosick Falls, right? So we already have case law that's been established to say that's something that would have a potential impact if you're using that material. So that's how case law helps these determinations. And the reason it says your reasoned elaboration is because generally this presentation is made to boards. They have to very clearly elaborate as to why they're determining that it is either a positive or a negative deck. Now, did we talk about what a pos deck and a negative deck is?
Yeah.
Positive deck, again, so that's the vocabulary. But here are some of the criteria. And reduction of wildlife habitat, hazard to human health, substantial change in the use of land, conflict with adopted community plans or goals, like a comprehensive plan, or impairment of community character. And that one is murky, but there's a lot of case law about it. And again, let's talk about that in the ending when we have a discussion. But substantive and literal compliance, as I mentioned before, are both important. Substantive meaning because the substance of the process was flawed. like someone didn't check off whether there would be emissions or there was an impaired waterway. In the case of the Carrier Dome in Syracuse, they neg-decked it. And can you think of a potential impact of, let's say, I don't know how many people, 40,000 people coming to a dome? What would it be? Traffic, right?
Water waste.
Water waste, maybe even night pollution, right? Light, right? So, so the case did the courts did not say that the what were the specific problems, although they did talk about them. But when courts make decisions, what they say is, what is the principle in effect here? And the principle in effect here was that this agency did not take a hard look at what the potential impacts would be. And so one of the requirements of Seqr, and this is one of the most important case laws, is that the agency, the lead agency, is obligated to take a hard look at the data to make sure that in determining significance, they do not believe it would have a potential significant adverse environmental impact. So if they give it a POSDEC or a neg-deck, they need to elaborate and reason on their determination on the last section, on their findings, that that they did all that they looked at that very carefully, and that they took a hard look, because that is, again, subject to challenge. So they're also required at the end of that form to look at the magnitude of the project. What would be, is it moderate? Is it localized? Could it be short-term because it's just construction? Could it be medium-term because maybe someone is putting in a culvert and they're taking away a bunch of vegetation, and when until that's restored or the next growing season comes, that particular slope might be subject to erosion. That might be a medium-term. Whereas a long-term or irreversible, well, you understand what that means. The impact could, if you're cutting down a whole stand of trees, staying in the subject of natural resources, or irreversible, that you're going to create maybe even a superfund on that site. That could be irreversible. So thinking about it in terms of context is really important, and also the likelihood. This is art, not science. Is it likely to occur? Will it possibly occur, or will it probably occur? Bye, Maxanne. Nice to see you. So think about the context. The context of these two projects is very different. On this side, you have the Walmart in Colony, and here is a Target in Minneapolis. And they're two very similar projects in terms of scope, but they're in very different contexts. So can anybody tell me what they think are maybe some different impacts of these two?
Some different impacts, different types of impacts?
Like if you were evaluating what the potential impact of that same big box store is on one side or the other, can you think of the differences? Gerald, do you have one?
There's a lot of paving.
Right, there's a lot of paving on that one, so that runoff would be a definite one. So if there's wetlands nearby or an aquifer, exactly. Drainage, exactly. What about the downtown one?
But there's architectural differences there.
Yeah, architectural differences, but maybe both of them are totally fitting with the comprehensive plan and zoning.
Blends in with the surrounding
Yes,
environment, and that one.
exactly. Yes, Clark.
Our Walmart slopes like that, the parking lot.
Yes, it does. It does, and actually I think they do it on purpose for drainage, but then you have to think about, what is the non-point source pollution that's going to come from all the cars dripping oil on the parking lot, et cetera, and the lack of pervious surface. So there's a lot of things to think about there. Maybe the traffic impacts of that one, maybe less here. On this one, though, in Minneapolis, it's clear that somebody had design guidelines, right? So, but the impacts of these both might be negative on the downtown, let's say, if they take business away from smaller businesses. So some communities have made decisions that that's not appropriate for them, but it may withstand Seqr and not then withstand their own site plan review. Yeah.
So, the traffic on the one downtown might have a smaller impact, like you said, because it's a walkable area and it's in that sort of environment. What about things like densifying neighborhoods on resources. For instance, like you have to put less pipes in to get water to something that's close to a bunch of other stuff.
So that's a fantastic question, because what that really is about is whether or not you're taking a hard look at all the potential impacts and what kind of impacts are you capable of anticipating. So for instance, what if, just what if, that a very, very large project is not in a community that has public transportation, right? It might increase traffic, right? We don't know that. But each issue has to be thought about very carefully to think about what the potential impacts are. What if, and I want to point this out before we go too far, if you don't have a potential environmental impact, and that means on the built environment, on the physical environment, Seqr says that you can't weigh the environment, the social and economic impacts against it. So you can only make a positive declaration on the basis of a physical impact. Physical, meaning traffic, air, water, other land use. So let's say you're thinking about whether or not that store is going to take away business from another store. If you don't have a potential physical environmental impact for a pos deck, you can't look at all those other factors, and you would not end up having an environmental impact statement. We're going to talk about that next, about whether or not you have an environmental process. But it's all about good, it's really all about good reasoning and taking a hard look. So the answer depends. A good professor said to me every time, the answer, it depends. Right. So if it will have at least one, it's a pos deck. Sorry, that's a little light. If it won't, then an environmental impact statement is not required and the process concludes. I'm going to speed up a little. A conditioned neg deck is for unlisted actions only, and that means that you have to reason and elaborate on all the reasons why an unlisted project might or might not have an impact, but generally not have an impact, because you can actually convert an unlisted action to a type 1 if you think that it's going to have a significant adverse environmental impact. You can require a environmental impact statement and issue a pos deck. So we're up to, wow, we're getting really close, folks. Environmental impact statement if needed. Let's look at what an environmental impact statement is. It is a disclosure document. It lets agencies, project sponsors, and the public systematically consider the significant adverse environmental impacts, a phrase which you need to get to know. And it's also required to look at alternatives to the project, like a no-build alternative, or a different site, or a different way of doing things, like, let's say, maybe not using one type of energy but another. And what are the mitigation? What are the ways of mitigating? And this is a page from the Pilgrim Pipeline. How many of you had a chance to look at that environmental impact statement? Okay. Yes, Rebecca.
So, we tried to take that to help you out.
Well, I've got to laugh, so.
If this is gonna come up, then we'll wait, but two things is the EIS is triggered with a pos deck.
Right.
Which gives everybody a chance to look at.
Yeah, we're going to look at scoping.
Right, and to create, that's the document that
Yes.
begins the scoping process. But are you getting into, I mean, the pos neg deck question that I have is that in Seqr, it gives you 20 days.
So the
Make that
20-day
determination, and so therefore there is a framework, except there are some exceptions. What is the meaning of all of that? I don't want to not address that.
So in very large project, it's very frequent that the 20-day guideline is not followed. And the reason is because even though the clock has started ticking on the establishment of the lead agency, 30 days, the project applicant and the lead agency can agree that they need more time. And as long as they agree that they need more time, they can take more time, because they might want to be exploring, or maybe, for example, I'm a developer and I haven't completely finished my design. I'm moving along in the process, but I realize that there are other things about the design that I haven't considered. So generally speaking, it's you're losing some momentum by doing that, but there's no hard and fast rule that it has to be 20 days. It's just that the lead agency and the sponsor, the project applicant, have to agree to lengthen it.
But what is the spirit of the 20 days?
Well, the spirit of the 20 days is to make sure that projects move through the review process in a timely fashion. And yeah, I think that's the spirit of it. I think that's also a longer debate. But I would say in general, the reason for the timelines and approval processes is to make sure that for example, board members don't change, so that you have people who are up to speed. Community is aware of what's going on and can follow the process. So all of those things are a part of timelines, and it's one of the reasons why the rules are very specific about how long you have to do a public hearing right after the application is complete, how many days you have, and how many days even in site plan review and special use permits you have between when the project is submitted and when you can have a public hearing and when you have to have an approval. It's in order to keep everyone on track, essentially. But as I said, there are a lot of complexities with big projects, so the 20-day rule is flexible.
When you say that Seqr, the process is a public one of my experiences in the town of Ulster was how actually mindful at times to create a timeline
Yeah,
for the Seqr process to give the public a sense of what's happening when.
what to expect.
How often do you come across that in communities with Seqr
It's very
process?
common. It's very common, especially for the environmental impact statement.
Where the
Yeah,
lead
the-
agency will provide a timeline for the community?
Oh, where the agency provides a timeline?
Who, I mean, you know what
I would say that many of the well-staffed communities that I've seen do try to keep the public informed. Like they'll have stuff on their website. For example, if you Google Seqr timeline, you will see that throughout New York State, there are various county planning agencies and local planning boards and so on or even regional planning commissions that have the same materials. They've gotten them from the Department of State or the Department of Environmental Conservation, and they put them up, and they're welcome to do so. And they create little citizen brochures and things like that. A lot of communities do that, not all. So the EAS process is that there's this pause deck. I know it's redundant, but it's important to kind of drill it in. Then there's something called formal scoping, and I'm sorry, this is wrong. It's not optional anymore. We'll talk about what scoping is. Draft environmental impact statement, public comment, and a final environmental impact statement. Let's move through that before you even forget what it is. Scoping is no longer optional as of January 1st, and it is a focus on significant issues. Scoping is not meant to be the kitchen sink. It's meant to be scoping, focusing, right? That's the idea. Anything that you can actually justify as a potential environmental impact. So let's say that nothing else is going to be impacted but the public that might live near the plume. You know, we keep talking about the plume, right? Or the fish in the impaired waterway. Well, then that might be all that the environmental impact statement has to look at. If, for example, public comment comes in and engineering reports and the lead agency all look at the environmental assessment form and say, that's the only thing you need to look at, then that's the only thing that the scope will include. But Seqr has something like 17 things. I think I showed you on the other page, those little boxes. Seqr, the procedures show all the things that you should technically try to look at and consider whether or not they are areas to study. But then scoping narrows it. And then the goal is to identify the alternatives, identify potential mitigation, and then also give other agencies, those other involved agencies or interested agencies, an opportunity to give input. And scoping is a process that has to be public. It is now not optional and should be done at a time when the public can participate. One of the main ways that they do so is by collecting public comment and doing that for at least a 30-day period.
Hey
So-
Jenny, there's about 10 minutes left
Yeah, okay.
in the
So I'll
presentation.
move very quickly through that. I think what Rebecca wants me to focus on is in fact the public process. So, public comment. As I said, there's a minimum 30-day period, and public hearing is actually optional, but not after after the application is complete. But before it is. And many communities have made the mistake of holding public hearings before the application was complete and then not holding it after because they said, oh, we already did a public hearing. That can be the downfall of that project. So it's very important. And we all want our community to succeed and do things right. So we want to make sure that they know that they're supposed to hold a public hearing after the application is complete. And the comment period should also be open at least 10 days after the public hearing closes. That's if you have a public hearing. And that's, by the way, can be during Seqr, but also has to be after. So the final environmental impact statement looks like this. It's basically 3 parts. It's the draft environmental impact statement, which was all those studies and that were in the scope, plus any revisions that the agency asked for, and they can ask for it one time. They can't go back again and again because the new law says that if you keep going back and making up new things, that makes the process indefinite. So the lead agency has to identify one time what they want the revisions to be, and that's something that people fought for so that the process was more certain, and that's been changed in the new law. Public comment, that has to be considered, and the lead agency's response to any substantive public comments. And those 3 things together are actually, there's no mystery about the final environmental impact statement. It actually is just those 3 things put together and made available to the public. So that's what the final environmental impact statement looks like. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about generic environmental impact statements because we have one in Kingston. We have many, but because that process was used for our comp plan. They actually put statements within the our comp plan to say what the potential environmental impact would be of each item, and that's called a general environmental impact statement. But the BOA, the Brownfield Opportunity Assessment for the Kingston Riverfront, that was a generic environmental impact statement, and communities use those in order to potentially take a whole area of land that might have something in common, like the waterfront, and consider the potential impacts. It can be conceptual, and it can set thresholds, so it can look at all of the issues that it knows about, and if a specific project comes along that requires more intervention or a deeper look, let's say at archaeological remains because they're going to dig, then they might have to do what's called a supplemental environmental impact statement. So if you hear the word supplemental, what it means is either the final environmental impact statement didn't include everything and the project somehow expanded its scope, and so there's a requirement for a supplemental, or you're doing a generic environmental impact statement, and when a project comes along in that area that's specific, they may have to do a supplemental because the scope is bigger than what was studied in the generic.
So generic environmental impact statement would be created in order to make sure that the potential impacts are covered somehow. My question is, in any project that comes in, is it to protect the resources or to support development moving more swiftly?
It's both. So the reason you would do a generic on a place like the Kingston waterfront is because if it's considered a blighted area or maybe a brownfield is the perception of blight, not just the actual reality of blight. So it's a way of looking at all the potential issues and identifying alternatives and mitigation measures so you can anticipate that and you can streamline development. So it's a good thing, but what it means is you're basically looking at what to expect in that area of land and what might be needed to mitigate, let's say, something like chemicals that were on sites, so that you could remediate them before projects are proposed. A public, like for example, the city of Kingston could then decide to invest in funds to remediate a site before attracting a developer. That might be a reason to do a generic environmental impact statement. Yeah, that a question? So we're going to skip that and all of that. These are basically rules for the lead agency. They have to issue findings. They have to file and provide notice. They have to write their final decisions. All of this is to make sure that they are not, I'm sorry about Judge Judy. She was on there from the presentation someone gave me. I added a lot, but I didn't take her out. But all of this is to withstand the challenge. You want to make sure you have a really good paper trail. That's the whole point behind findings and notice of completion and all those other things. And all of these timelines is so ultimately the public feels it has recourse when the process is not followed correctly. So the recent updates are very simple, and that'll give me 3 minutes for that. Why were they needed? Because the last time they were revised was 1995. What's happened since 1995?
Quite a lot.
A lot. Like what did you say?
Quite a lot.
The internet? Well, it was around, but we weren't using it. So now everybody's required to post on a website. They're required to make things electronically available. What else has happened? Oh, so look, changes to, this is too long, but changes to type 2 lists. I told you that there were 37, right? Now there are 54. What would they include? Things like solar panels on landfills, right? Because we want to encourage that. Or rehabs to historic buildings. Or green infrastructure. Nobody was talking about green infrastructure in 1995. So you can go organic digesters. So things that people want to see happen that don't presume not to have an environmental impact. Type 1 list, they've lowered the thresholds, which what that means is actually that it's more stringent. So instead of being 1,000 parking places in a city under 150,000, now it's 500 parking spaces in a city under 150,000. So those are certain thresholds that they lowered in order to make sure that more projects might be subject to Seqr because they could have an impact on those communities of those sizes.
I just had a quick question. If a type 1 project is large scale enough to be considered type 1, what's the point of the negative declaration?
The neg deck is if you've looked at the entire project, the whole action, and not one thing appears to be a significant adverse environmental impact. So for example, maybe that store in Minneapolis would not have gotten a pause deck in New York City. See what I mean?
But if it's just large scale enough anywhere, it seems highly unlikely there's some sort of, like, why not just institute maybe not an in-depth Seqr immediately, but like a lighter one? I just don't understand the point of the complete out, because it's...
I hear you, but it is true that it all depends on the context. So the same Walmart in one context might have a very different impact than in another context, and that's up to the community to look at all of the evidence that's provided, disclosed, and gathered, and make that determination. And again, take the heat for it, because if they're wrong, they can be sued. And that's the point behind the whole self-enforcing thing and the Article 78 that you hear so much about.
You go ahead.
You talked about that, was it the public comment can't happen until the application is complete?
No, the public comment can happen as early as the agency wants to if they want to gather information.
But you talked about the application being complete.
But let's go back to that slide very quickly.
What were you referring to? When is this application completed?
So public comment There's a
The
minimum of
application-
30
But
days.
shouldn't the application?
They could have public comment for 3 months like they're doing here in Kingston.
But the application is complete when they submit it and Seqr begins.
It's complete
Oh.
it's complete when the applicant says, I've given you everything I need to give you for this project, and the agency has said it's adequate and accurate, basically.
And that's prior to a determination being.
Prior to determination, they will say that the application is complete. Well,
I'm
yes,
just wondering
And that's
here
Oh,
why
on
the
this
determination
diagram,
shouldn't
this
take forever.
diagram here,
yeah.
which point the application is complete on here? Is it?
The application, well, it depends on whether or not if you're going, let's say you're talking about a type 1 project, it would be that you've given all the information that would be needed for
The full EAF?
the full EAF. That's
And
right.
after that point, that's when the application is complete?
The application is complete when you've got the full EAF before you go on to the environmental impact statement.
Yeah, okay.
That's right. It's before the determination of significance.
So, let's say, we didn't talk much about mitigation, and so what I wanted to ask is, what happens if the project goes through its studies and it finds out the project's too large, or it's too this or that?
And there are conditions applied.
And so, but that doesn't mean anything, like it does, but explain it in
Okay.
layman
So
terms,
then,
what happens
mhm.
when something has to be changed in the project as it was?
Okay,
Through
so
secret
the
process.
the author of the environmental impact statement, which is usually a consultant hired by the applicant, but not always, and that's usually like a big engineering firm, right, like Chazen or Barton Judas, and they have a lot of engineers and planners and environmentalists on staff. So they would make recommendations about what the mitigation would be. And let's say we're talking about, I don't know, traffic impacts. They might suggest that the mitigation would be a different pattern, or an addition of a traffic light, or that sort of thing. So that would be a mitigation measure. I'm giving a very simple one. But if there's a place where there's so much traffic created, or that they need to add a new intersection or a new traffic light, that would be a mitigation.
So
that
the
they would-
mitigation may or may not have been a part of I mean, how is that included in the project in the end?
So then the recommendation is made, the findings are written up by the lead agency, the planning board, and when they do their site plan review,
I see.
they incorporate it into their decision-making process, and they put conditions on the project.
Got it. So that comes
Yeah.
after the seeker, they apply that to their discretionary decision-making.
Right, so yes, so then because don't forget, it doesn't replace the review for site plan, et cetera. They still have to go through their process of reviewing the site plan, and they now have a lot of data that they can use. For example, even in a regular site plan review at the county where I worked, we would sometimes say to the applicant, well, I'm sorry, you have to do a traffic impact study for us because there's more than 100 cars coming out at rush hour. So we want to know whether or not that's going to require another signal or a new intersection or whatever, a left-hand turning lane. So just as an example. But that would be based on a DOT level. First of all, you might have to get information from the Department of Transportation, but you might also require a traffic engineer to look at standards. There are a lot of standards available in the traffic engineering world, and this is true about every single discipline when it comes to land use and environment, that there are well-recognized mitigation measures for each one, whether it's the restoration of wetlands or a stream bank or a traffic path. So I hope that explains it.
Another thing too that we haven't touched upon too is this idea of a coordinated review means that if it's a process between the lead agency and an applicant, the outcome is something that is then applied to all of the other involved agencies making discretionary decisions for the project, right? In other words,
Sorry.
well, no, but I think these are the details. In other
Yeah.
words, a coordinated review is a great thing in order to keep
Yes.
everybody together.
Yes.
If a body is not, though, aware of the process that's in front
Yeah,
of
it's
them.
true that capacity is a very big issue in any review. So a really good example of that is the Williams Lake project. Is anybody familiar with that?
Yeah.
So, and I didn't talk about lead agency disputes, but that was an example where the town of Rosendale and the Department of Environmental Conservation, there was a dispute over who should be the lead agency, and I'm not sure who started that dispute, but I believe it might have been the community that said, we want the Department of Environmental Conservation to look at this project because it is such a significant area.
And the
The
public
bats,
pipeline was the same.
right, the karst aquifer, the historic resources, the community impact, et cetera, of a large project. So actually, in a very rare move, DEC took lead agency status. But the story doesn't end there in terms of coordination. All the agencies, including mine and a lot of others, we were all at the table for a lot of the time. And that process was a very detailed and coordinated review because everyone wanted to make sure, whether it was the town of Rosendale and their Conservation Advisory Council, or the DEC, or even Ulster County, which was asked to help mediate that, everyone was at the table. So not every community has that level of ability to be at the table because they may not have the expertise. But that's where the agency can, and I didn't show it in the slides because again it's another procedural question, the agency can actually charge a fee for reviewing the environmental impact statement, for hiring an expert to review it. They can even prepare the environmental impact statement if they want to. If the consultant doesn't wish to, somebody has to create it. But they can't charge for both because then they'd be reviewing themselves. But the point is, if they don't have the expertise, they can charge the applicant. And then they have the expertise, and that's a very important part of the law because it makes it possible for the involved agency to have the capacity it needs to do the review.
So it's 7:30 now, but I would like to open up to questions.
Yes.
1 second, Jenny. Questions for 5 more minutes because they close the library. at
Oh yes,
8
I
o'clock.
forgot about that.
So
Anyone who hasn't asked a question yet who wants to, okay.
So have you heard of any municipalities sort of figuring out their own, like a Kingston cookbook for Seqr in advance? That would be a sort of more advanced planning effort, but it seems like if we sort of knew, because all of these things need to be tightly choreographed, really, if an involved agency, if members of the public knew that a time frame would be, in general, you know, laid out in advance. If the city itself could sort of figure, you know, out what a standard template would be for reviews. If what generally will happens, where the planning board would become lead agency, and you know, then when a coordinated review would happen, is there a municipality who has done that, or
Well,
that you know
you
of?
remember I showed you this one. So for our TV audience, are there communities that have figured out their timeline in advance? Well, they still have to base it on the rules of that timeline, more or less, with the exception, as I said, of things that are by agreement. And again, also the municipality is supposed to state if they're going to expand that timeline so that the public knows. Again, all about disclosure, right? In fact, but I don't know of a community that has gone out of its way to, you know, to except to say the public should become aware of this. For example, there are many communities that are very proactive about these things, like Ithaca in Tompkins County comes to mind. They've created a citizen's guide to Seqr, but it's still very general. You know, generally, and this is a plug for planners, planning is very underfunded and understaffed, so it's very difficult to see, for me to imagine planners in a municipality as busy as Ithaca or even Kingston being able to find the time to do that. But what they can do is make sure that the public knows about what's out there and you know, that's, it's out there. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I don't think that I've seen a community do that, you know, specifically when it's in fact very prescribed.
It is, but I think the mechanism by which it would happen locally.
Yeah.
And just as Rebecca has said, knowing what to expect.
Yeah.
You know, just laying out a template of this is, you know, this is what we're planning, which will involve the public hearing. We'll try to do it around this date or something like that.
I can provide you with some very best practices, examples. There's some communities that have excellent planning. I think Saratoga is a good example. Buffalo is a great example, and Ithaca. There's a few others that I could mention. So I think one of the things we could do is maybe give Rebecca those best practices, and she could put them up online so people could look at them. And you had a question too, but yeah. Okay, he had his hand up first, and then I'll get to you, Jenny.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. When the lead agency gives permission to the applicant to move forward, does the applicant have to provide any, I noticed time constraints in all of this.
Yeah.
Does the applicant have to provide any time for his project or anything?
No, they may, for example, disappear altogether. So, for example, if we're talking about the environmental impact statement, if it is generally, the ball is generally in the applicant's court when it comes to submitting materials.
And also, does the applicant have to provide finances, that they have the money to move forward with this project?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I don't know the answer to that, except to say that some communities pass local laws requiring bonding, for example. Not all communities, but that's a local law that is separate from Seqr.
Yeah, I know this. I don't want to go any further.
But they might, for example, but what I'm saying, is that communities can go above and beyond so long as it's not in contradiction to a state law. They could, for example, require that a project be bonded so that it doesn't fail.
With all of these factors that are involved in this, I find it amazing how some projects got passed.
Yeah. Now, I want to mention, though, that this question is, in fact, very reasonable, and a lot of, like I said, a lot of communities do require a certain amount of this bonding. Especially, for example, if you have special use permit and you require someone to do landscaping and maintain it, they could be bonded for a long period of time, so that if they ever fail to do it, or the business goes, let's say Dollar General goes out of business, and we required them to have a landscaping strip, the community would have recourse so that they could continue to maintain that. But Jenny had a question, and then Ellen.
I keep on reminding myself that this is law.
Yes.
So at some point it goes before a judge, is that right?
No.
Oh,
So
we showed a picture.
it's a procedure that's based on the law.
Right.
And it only goes before a judge if someone challenges the decision of the agency.
I see.
So they can file an Article 78 within 30 days. It's a very short time frame
Of the final agency
of the
decision.
findings.
Final.
The file
Final EIS.
of see where it says final agency decision?
Yes, yes.
So underneath it says findings, and then they file their decision,
Right.
and there's a notice of completion, and it's filed with the clerk. If someone feels once that thing is stamped within 30 days, they don't agree with it, they can challenge the findings.
And it's important that the process has to come to an end.
Yeah.
Before there can be a
That's right.
legal challenge.
That's right.
So even though you
Yeah.
might dispute some part of the process,
Right.
it has to get to the bitter end
Right.
before you can actually challenge.
Well, and the bitter end could be a neg deck, or the bitter end could be that they decided it was a no review, or that it wasn't subject to Seqr.
So anywhere where it ends.
Anywhere where they have to file a decision and state their findings, which they have to do, every planning, zoning board, etc., has to write its decisions. Findings are an application of facts leading to conclusions. Right?
One more question.
Yeah. Ellen.
Well, this is sort of piggybacking on this comment. In your professional opinion and experience,